Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor, and we will be calling you back up for questions and comments by the committee members. I'll now introduce our third speaker, Jason Cisney, the Chief Deputy Legislative Analyst of the State Local Finance. So welcome, and you may begin your comments.
And there'll be a handout that is being distributed that also will be available on our website later this morning. Thank you for having me. I oversee the part of the Legislative Analyst Office that looks at the California economy and our tax revenues, among other issues, and we're pleased to participate in oversight hearings like this. In addition, all of our analyses are available online at our website, lao.ca.gov, and we're available to you and your staffs throughout the year if we can be of assistance as you think about policy and legislation and budget. Definitely feel free to ask. In the handout, on the first page after the cover, I thought I'd give some big picture perspective on legislative oversight of state departments, which our office has been helping the legislature with for 75 years now. And one of the things that I think we would advise as you go through this process of thinking about GoBiz, this State Department, is to think throughout the process on what are the key responsibilities of this office, the department GoBiz that you're looking at. What do you want it to achieve? And consider as you do that, are these activities that other public, private, or nonprofit entities already perform or could perform well? I think many local governments, many local economic development corporations and others also have various entities, various programs that help to assist businesses. And think about those sorts of programs, and are those best performed at the statewide level through an office like GoBiz, or at the local level as you have in some of your communities? As you think about oversight and the future committee discussions where you're talking to GoBiz, we would just advise you something's probably pretty obvious. Every organization has strengths and weaknesses. And I think that it's important that you should try to be thinking about both those strengths and weaknesses and asking GoBiz and other witnesses who have interactions with GoBiz about what they think the strengths and weaknesses are. Stakeholders provide one important perspective, the people who deal with a State Department. And most departments have a group of individuals, a group of organizations that deal with them regularly. They frequently come to committee hearings like this, and they can provide very useful perspectives on what a department is doing well and not doing well. A more difficult issue for you to consider, though, is who isn't interacting with a department like GoBiz. What sorts of individuals, organizations, and businesses are they not making a connection with that you would like them to? And this can help you consider how the focus of a department like GoBiz could be changed. You want to think about California as a whole, and I think some of the other witnesses have talked about that. And overall, we would just urge you to be skeptical. That's really one of the critical components we find of legislative oversight of a department, is to really go in with kind of a skeptical eye. This is a department, GoBiz, that was created in its present form in 2011. It's had about 24 pieces of legislation since then that have added to its responsibilities. And I think from our perspective, it's perfectly understandable to be skeptical that they could be doing all of those things well, all of the things you might expect. And I think that part of oversight is trying to help the legislature and the executive branch come to agreement on what are the things they should be prioritizing, what are the things that maybe should be a little bit less prioritized so that they can do the things well. The next page has just a little bit of a hint, and you'll hear more in your future committee discussions about GoBiz. I think that they can present in your background materials, has an outline of the various groups within GoBiz. As we've looked at the organization over the years through the budget process and through looking at bills, we kind of think of it as having 4 key functions that we summarize there. It's a policy advisor. GoBiz is supposed to recommend changes to state policies to advance statewide economic goals and respond to economic problems and opportunities. That's pretty much verbatim from the legislation that created it. GoBiz has a lot of small units that assist businesses, that are a point of contact for businesses considering relocating to or expanding here. They have resources online that help with that as well. They have come to administer the California Competes tax credit, which you may remember was created a few years ago and will grow to about $200 million of tax credit allocation annually. This is a program that the legislature will have the opportunity to review in full in a couple of years when its existing authorization comes to a close. And we look forward to working with the legislature as it does that over time. And then lastly, the GoBiz has been given oversight responsibilities for a few other pre-existing state programs that have their own governing boards, the Film Commission, Travel and Tourism Commission, and the Infrastructure Bank. On to the last page. Just some big pictures, issues to consider in this discussion about GoBiz. I think as we've reflected on it, GoBiz is a small department, and California is a very big economy, and you've heard about that this morning. The parts of GoBiz that are really aimed at helping businesses that contact it have about a couple dozen employees. And I think it's important to be realistic about what an entity of that size can do. It's not likely, even with the tax credit program that they administer, that they're going to cause a noticeable jump or in the total number of jobs or economic activity in California. This is a small organization. And you will want to consider, in thinking about performance metrics, that is, when it's contacted by businesses, does it do that well? Does it do it promptly? Does it help those businesses achieve the goals for which they contacted GoBiz in the first place? So that's really helping the few, the businesses that contact GoBiz, the businesses that apply for a tax credit. There's another function, though, that's in the statute, and that's really thinking about policy as a whole, thinking about the state's economic development policies, helping the governor and the legislature do that. The statute says that GoBiz is to be the lead entity for economic strategy and the marketing of California on issues related to business development, private sector investment, and economic growth. And as I mentioned earlier, it has specific duties to advise the governor and the legislature on policy related to emerging economic trends. And as we think of it, these are tasks designed to help all businesses in the state. They're very hard to measure. You're going to have a hard time coming up with performance metrics for how they do this job well. And I think as you think about GoBiz during these hearings, and for that matter even over the next few years in this committee, and as you think about your bill packages, should GoBiz be more oriented toward helping those individual businesses that contact it, or should it be more oriented toward helping the governor and the legislature frame overall economic policy in the state? Which is a very hard job. One perspective that I would give is that, when I think about economic trends, emerging economic problems in the state, I think of the cost of housing, particularly in our coastal communities where a lot of our economy is centered. Rising housing costs make it harder for our firms, including our large, very important, profitable firms, to attract and retain the employees they need. And that's an economic development issue about what kind of, how affordable is housing going to be in our communities for low, middle, and even upper income people. We've heard from Assembly members this year, kind of wondering, what does the governor want to do on housing? It's a very difficult issue, very controversial if you've ever sat on a county board or a city council, how to approve new housing. Is that the sort of thing that the state's lead economic development entity should be helping the governor think about? There's not a right answer to that because, obviously doing big policy issues like that comes at the cost of doing other things. And I think that these are among the difficult issues that you'll want to consider. With that,
thank you.
Yes, we'll bring the panel.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask both our two previous witnesses if you'll just stay seated there, and we'll begin with some questions and comments from our committee members. And I appreciate the broad and general perspectives that you've shared as we look at evaluating not only economic development agencies for the state, but across the board, right? That we have a good metric system to measure, outcomes of the investments that are being made. So I'll open it up for questions from any of my colleagues at this time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Granted that Go Business is a small business, small organization, relatively speaking, I was yet surprised when I talked to small business owners in my district when they didn't even know about the existence of GoBiz, let alone the different programs that they run, for example, California Compete. So would you consider helpful to include as a performance metric the ability of GoBiz to, let's say, outreach to the community? Would that be a good measure?
Elaine Howell, State Auditor. Absolutely, Assemblymember Chow. That's one of a very important metric because you're right. Many small businesses, my brother owns a small business, and I'm sure he has no idea GoBiz exists. And I think the metric is not only the outreach, but the results of that. Again, you may hold sessions throughout the state, and you have several small businesses. For example, if my brother attended one of those events. Okay, now he has the information, but let's follow through and see, did it benefit him down the road? Did he end up using some of the services that GoBiz provides? So I think the metric, not just outreach, but then follow through as far as, okay, we had 500 small businesses attend an orientation session in some part of the state of California. Of those 500 businesses, how many actually use the services of GoBiz, and then what was the result of those services provided to that small business?
And I'd just like to add, I mean, communication about what we do as an economic development group is critical, and whether it's small business programs or any of the programs. And so that's something that economic development groups really struggle with because they rarely have the resources. They have program resources. They don't have marketing resources. And so this is a challenge for them. So I just want to point that out. And I'd also like to say that, one of the issues can be, well, we understand that we're not going to touch every business in the state. And so, just making sure that that's not the expectation that goes along with the metric, and incorporating not every business is going to look to the state or to the local economic development group for assistance. They're going to look, there are a variety of resources out there. Certainly economic development groups play an important role, but that's not true for every single business that's out there. So.
Thank you. I have been thoroughly enlightened this morning. Thank you for your presentations. One of the things that I wanted to ask Jason Mr. Sisney about was, you said, what is the desired focus? And then you said, it's either this or that. Why can't you do both?
Good question. You can do both. And I think that one of the upshots of doing both, or of wanting an entity like GoBiz to do more marketing, is they may need more resources, which you would have to think about through this committee as well as through the budget process. I think that doing both with the level of staffing they have now will be very difficult. And I think that to the extent that you want to increase the priority of some activities, they may well need additional resources, and you'll have to think about how to negotiate with the governor and within the legislature for how to get those.
One of the things that I find, and I've been on the outside and now on the inside, is that whenever you try to reach the people that you want to reach, there seems to be a breakdown. One big firm, usually that lives in New York or someplace else, gets the contract to do the outreach. And by the time the outreach comes to the community, there's no money left to do the outreach. Do you have any ideas about how we can ensure that we can use the resources of California to make it more pointed that we have to reach? We're going to use these resources to reach people rather than fighting it off from every little organization that's a middleman to get to the people.
Sure. I think that as you go through, future witnesses as well as hearing from GoBiz at future hearings, you can think about the target audience here. And I think to a large extent you are trying to reach small businesses and medium-sized businesses throughout the state. I think that you would want to hear from the groups that represent those small businesses about what are their perspectives about the way to promote awareness of what this organization does at the statewide level, and hopefully come up with ways to do it in as cost-effective a way as possible. I mean, I think it's likely you may need additional resources to do it, but we're not necessarily talking about a media contract. We're not trying to reach every single Californian. You're trying to reach really small businesses, which are just a subset of the population. So hopefully that can be done in a cost-effective way. And I think the best way is to ask the advice of groups who represent those businesses throughout the state.
Thank you.
Any other questions to my left?
Morning. As we're talking about the matrix and getting into, the frequency, what are the variables, the specifics, the thing that always comes to my mind is within the mechanisms that we're putting in place to track these numbers, what's being done with seasonal employment? Because we always have a lot of hiring in August for back to school, over Christmas break. And then these jobs get tailored off. I was a department supervisor for Mervyn's once upon a time. We tailor these jobs off, and are they still being tracked? And you mentioned that some of this frequency, it's the same job over and over. So are the stats that we're getting convoluted with this? Are we still showing that people are working when they're down to 2 hours a week? What is being done on that end to ensure that we have the mechanisms in place with our stats within the metrics to ensure that these are getting weeded out, so we actually know, okay, did the unemployment rate actually drop? Did we get more jobs? Or is it just there's 100 people that are working, but they're working 2 hours a week and they're just on the books? Can you touch on that and enlighten us a little bit more on that?
So economic statistics are one good source of information, one good source of data to assess what's happening at the end of the economy, but they're usually inadequate to address what's happening at the economic development level or at the community level, and they lag and they don't give you all the information that you want. So while they are important sources of information, they probably shouldn't be the only source of information, especially for a program evaluation. And so deciding at the economic development organization level, whether it's a state or local level, exactly which jobs you want to count and when you want to count them, and then how often you count them to get at some of those issues, and then connecting that to the efforts of the economic development group would be what we're trying to get at. And so sources of data for that tend to start with the company themselves. Good reporting by companies that you've worked with, so they give you this data on in the time frame that you want, and then validating it when possible with other data sources. So I think that just looking at the economic statistics would keep you in that bind that you just described, but you should do both.
Yeah, all I would add, Assemblymember Mathis, is as I described earlier, is making sure you have a clear definition. So if a job is a full-time position that someone has been employed in for a minimum of 6 months, if that's what we're counting, or that's what we've decided the definition of a job that's been created, because one of the issues during the Recovery Act reporting was there were a lot of programs that were going to last a year or 2 years, and we thought we created a tremendous number of jobs. For a short period of time, we did, but a lot of those individuals no longer had employment once that program exhausted all of its funds. So I think defining your measures up front and being very specific. If you want to track seasonal employment, that's fine, but let's categorize that a little bit differently than a full-time permanent position. That's the other reason why I suggested periodic reporting, because you want to be able to assess, have you maintained that full-time position over the course of a year? That job that was created in 2016, is that person still employed in that position full-time in 2017 and 2018?
So is that mechanism in place, or is that something that...
I don't have that information as far as GoBiz, as far as whatever, but in developing the metrics going in, and again, as I said, in looking at, I haven't looked at their strategic plan, but I would expect that the various units within GoBiz would be very specific about what metrics they want to track and then define those metrics, if it's a job or if it's outreach or some other metric that they think is important to determine whether or not they're achieving their objectives. Haven't looked at that, but that's something that I think is critically important. And get it right in the beginning before you start measuring. Go ahead.
Let me add that the benchmark employment statistics that you see talked about in the newspaper, they come from the Employment Development Department and the federal government. They consider both non-adjusted employment, that is the actual numbers that are reported in surveys of both workers and of households, businesses and households. But they also, in addition to that non-adjusted total, they include seasonally adjusted totals, where basically statisticians use statistical techniques to kind of even out those seasonal differences throughout the year. When you see a discussion of the state or national employment rate, it's typically looking at those seasonally adjusted totals, and furthermore, it's usually looking at non-farm jobs. And the reason for that is because farm jobs, as you would be well aware, not only are seasonal, but are very, very difficult to track. And so to the extent that you wanted an entity like GoBiz to focus on those sorts of jobs in the agricultural sector, you would probably want to task them with looking at some of the other data sets from Department of Agriculture and other sources that really try to do a good job of looking at farm employment, which is very difficult to track for the government.
Any other questions?
No, I'm not looking particularly on the farm sector. It's just, I want to ensure that as we move forward and as we're actually looking at these things, we're looking at full-time jobs, not just the part-time, and making sure that there's actually something there to separate that so we can look at clear numbers and not have it convoluted, which it often is. Thank you.
Thank you, Assembly Member.
Ms. Howe, you talked about definitions being important. Mm-hmm. When we were doing the RDA wind down and we were in the work committee, we found that the definitions of, for example, the word loan, that Department of Finance went to the dictionary to figure out what the loan was. And as we sat and talked about it, Mr. Chow, I think we sat and we talked about really what is the definition of a loan. Well, Webster's dictionary was very, very specific. And that was the matrix, or that's what they used to say whether or not these cities could keep their money or if they, what do they have to do with it. Are we using the wrong definition or the wrong basis for the definition? Should we look at it from that standpoint? I never looked at it being that small of a thing. But
Right. I think the program, as I discussed earlier, each of these units within GoBiz needs to understand what's its mission, what are we hoping to accomplish, and the permitting unit, what are we hoping to accomplish? We're hoping to help businesses, navigate that and streamline it and make it easier for businesses. So we need to establish, or the GoBiz needs to establish definitions that make sense for that particular program. I wouldn't necessarily, with all due respect to Department of Finance, I wasn't involved in that, is you don't necessarily go to the dictionary for the definition. You want to understand, GoBiz needs to understand, and the legislature needs to agree that this particular unit within GoBiz, this is the mission, this is the purpose, this is what we expect it to accomplish for small businesses in California. And then these are the metrics that we expect to use to determine whether or not we're accomplishing, GoBiz is accomplishing those objectives, and then define that and define it in a way that makes sense for that particular program and makes sense for small businesses. Because if you're expecting small businesses to report information up, those businesses need to understand, what am I reporting? What exactly is the definition of a job? What exactly is the definition of a loan? Everyone agrees to what that definition is, and then you have consistent information being reported. So long answer to your question, but I don't think you want a definition to be narrow. You want it to work for the particular program that you're trying to assess.
So we just need to broaden definitions. As I'm hearing you, I'm just trying to give it back to you. We need to broaden the definitions when we're talking about what we're doing here in Sacramento, and especially as it relates to how a business would understand it.
That's correct. I think the legislature and the administration need to understand what is the mission of this particular department, units within that department, what's the legislature's intent, what do you want GoBiz to be able to accomplish, and then agree as to what the metrics are that are going to determine, to be used to assess whether or not success. What's your definition of success? And that will lead you down the path of identifying specific metrics and then ultimately defining those metrics.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If there aren't any other questions or comments, I'd like to thank you for participating. This has been very helpful. I'll tell you, about a week ago, I sat in a joint hearing in our Transportation Committee looking at the California Air Resources Board and a lot of the investments going into our transportation as it relates to greenhouse gases, and a very similar conversation about how do we begin to measure these investments and the goals of reducing greenhouse gases, but at the same time making sure that we are not impacting and having unintended consequences on the business climate here in California. So I am going to assume that there's going to be a lot of this type of conversation across the board when it comes to programs, whether they be newer programs or older programs, in terms of where investments are going and what the outcomes are. So thank you very much for setting a framework for what I think will be a very constructive, productive conversation as we move forward. So thank you.